Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to put together the gearboxes on the Bullhead. The manual's a bit odd for this assembly because they're 99% identical. We do steps 9 to 26 twice. For the video we're only going to put one gearbox together. The other one will probably make the odd appearance here and there, but there's not really any point in doing everything twice on video. Today then we're going to start at step 9, the axle tubes. Right, we're going to be needing a pair of axle shafts, one with a hole in the end and one with the pin. We need two E1 axle tubes, four 6mm washers. They're very thin and probably feel more like shims. Four 5mm E-clips. And if you're building using the kit bushings, we need two 1260 bushings and two 1260 bearings. We've got a full bearing kit though, so we'll just use four 1260s. It's worth noting all the steps from 9 to 26 have the part quantities for two axles. So on the left it says we need 8 washers, 4 per axle. Another note, with the stock bushings you're going to want to follow the instructions and use some of the kit grease on the shafts. With the bearings it's going to be a lot cleaner and just as smooth without. Right, the actual assembly here is really simple. At the dog bone end we need to clip an E-clip into the slot. A thin pair of pliers with a grippy tip works a treat. Line everything up and give it a gentle squeeze until the clip just pops in. If you're worried about losing the clip, stick your hand and the pliers in a clear plastic bag so if it does ping off it won't go far. Next we slide on a washer so it's up against the E-clip, followed by a bearing. The shaft now goes through the outside of an axle tube. It needs to go in far enough that we can get at the slot at the other end. If you press the bearing in so it's flush with the end of the plastic, you're going to be good to go. On the inside we need to slide on a bearing. Again, make sure it's flush with the plastic. Follow the bearing with another washer and clip in an E-clip. Make sure the shaft spins nicely. If there's a problem with a bearing, it's much easier to sort it out now rather than later. Rinse and repeat, so we've got a pair of tubes ready to fit. Step 10, the big side of the gearbox. For this one we need 4 M3x12s, 4 M3 flange nuts and B10 the gearbox half. For this side we need to use the axle with a hole in the end and offer it up to the side of the gearbox. The tube has a pin at the end that locates in a hole in the gearbox, so if we just use a tiny bit of pressure and turn it, it should drop in. Now we pop a screw in from the inside and use a nut on the outside 4 times to hold it all together. Now I'm building a cruiser here rather than a basher, so I'm not really planning on needing to swap the tubes too often. If we did need to, there's going to be a lot to take apart to get at the screws. Now there's a couple of ways to help, which both essentially boil down to using slightly bigger screws and nuts, so you can remove the nuts, leaving the screws threaded into the plastic. When all 4 screws are in and the nuts are nipped up, that's step 10 complete. Step 11, the other half of the gearbox, which is pretty much the same as step 10. We need 4 M3 flange nuts, 4 M3x12s and B9 the gearbox half. Just like before, all we need to do is offer up the tube to the gearbox and fit the 4 screws and nuts. Nip them up and that's step 11 done. Step 12, the gears. Now this is where things get a bit more interesting. We need 2 1260 bearings, 2 850 bearings, 2 step shafts, the 44 and 50 tooth counter gears, and the plastic spacer B12. Now the kit comes with 2 tubes of grease, but when using bearings you can just about comfortably get away with only using the one. We don't need to use any on the shafts, just the teeth and a few spots later on for the steering and suspension. We're going to fit the gears into the shallow gearbox half as per the manual. First in is the 50 tooth gear, so we need to pop a big bearing in on one side and a small one on the other. Pop a shaft in and offer it up to the hole in the gearbox. Once in, the gear should spin very freely. If it's a bit catchy, you might want to look for any stray bits of plastic. Get it running nicely now and you won't have to strip it down later. The 44 tooth gear is roughly the same, except we need a B12 spacer between the bearings. It's easiest if we load up the shaft with a big bearing and spacer and pop it into the gear. Then fit the small bearing on the other end. Pop it into the hole in the gearbox and give it a spin to test. Next we need to grease up the big gear, and there's no need to go silly, we just need enough that after a few spins you can see there's a bit of grease coating all the teeth. It's debatable whether you should grease up the other big gear though. It meshes with a metal pinion, so it's going to run well enough dry. The thing is though, the gearbox is fairly roomy inside, so it's going to end up getting greased as the grease gets flung around anyway. Step 13, the differential. This time we need three 3x14 shafts, 3 small bevel gears, 2 brass spline to hex adapters, the main diff gear, and the 2 large bevel gears. If we look at the main diff gear, we can see on one side there's a set of cups that the shafts want to sit in. We're going to add a small blob of grease in each one, partly to make sure there aren't any dry spots left, and partly to stick it all together until the gearbox is put together. All of the diff gears essentially float, so the grease really does make it a lot easier to assemble. For the 3 small bevel gears, we need to put a small blob of grease on one end and insert the shaft. Then drop it into one of the slots in the main gear. You need to make sure the shaft is all the way down and not half up sitting at an angle. That will ruin the gear mesh. Repeat with the other 2 and add some more grease around the centre hole and add a little bit on the bevel gear teeth. Next we insert one of the brass bits into one of the big bevel gears. I like to add a little bit of grease to make it easier on the flats of the hex before inserting it. Squirt a blob of grease into the spline on the hex adapter and slide it onto the axle shaft. Slide on the diff assembly so the grease we put on the small bevel gears sticks it to the big bevel gear. Add some more grease to this side of the small bevel gears and run some around the outside of the main gear. Pop the second bevel gear onto the diff, and that should be the gear train ready to go. Give it a quick spin to make sure it all spins okay. If so, that's step 13 complete. Okay, step 14, mating the gearbox halves. This time we need 2 M3x30s, 2 M3x15s, 1 M3x12 and 6 M3 plain nuts. For the most part, this is pretty self-explanatory. We just want to put the halves of the gearbox together and fit the screws. Except there's an extra nut that you could easily miss. On the half with the gears in, there's a hex-shaped hole that we need to drop the nut in. If you forget it, you're going to very quickly notice it when we get to step 16. Otherwise, we just need to offer the halves up. If they don't want to line up properly, give the dog bones a bit of a wiggle while gently pressing them together. Now on the bottom of the gearbox we fit the 2 M3x30s with their nuts. On the front we use the 3x15s, and on the very back behind the motor we use the M3x12. Nip them up and that's the gearbox put together and in one piece. Step 15, the pinion. For this one we're going to need a motor, a pinion and a 3x3 grub screw. For tools we're going to need a metal bit that has a notch in it to position the pinion and the Allen key from the kit. Of course any 1.5mm Allen key will do, but the one in the kit does the job well enough. From the box the motor has a rubber tube on the shaft to protect it. We can just pull it off and get rid as we're not going to be needing it. Next we pop the grub screw into the pinion just a couple of turns with the Allen key, then offer it up to the motor shaft and very gently just take up the slack. So we can get the pinion in just the right spot, we have this special tool that has a notch cut in it that sits over the end of the pinion. We set the pinion position by pushing it right up against the notch and do up the grub screw. Nice and simple, but I would very highly recommend getting a 13-tooth, 32-pitch steel or brass pinion. The stock aluminium one works okay, but they do wear out very quickly, mixing the ground up aluminium dust with the grease in the gearbox, which really isn't ideal. Otherwise, fitting an aftermarket pinion is just the same. Fit it, do up the grub screw, and that's step 15 complete. Step 16, motor fitting. For this one we need 2 M3x30s, an M3x20, an M3x10, an M3 plain nut, and 2 3x25mm tubes. For plastic there's B11, the anti-rotation bracket, and the pinion cover B7. The 3x30s and the tubes can go off with the pinion cover for the moment while we deal with the other bits. On the top of the gearbox we use the M3x20 and the plain nut just like we did in step 14. Why this screw isn't in step 14 I'm not sure, but there we go. Next, the bracket gets screwed into the nut that we buried in the gearbox. Of all the bits on the stock clod / bullhead, these little brackets are a major weak point. Essentially, they transmit all the power from the motor to the wheels. They're what stops the gearbox from spinning inside the suspension. So in effect, the little bit of plastic around the screw is taking pretty much all the abuse from accelerating, braking and attempted wheelies. You can get an aftermarket aluminium one that's a direct fit, or you can cut one from some aluminium angle stock. Or if you want to go really over the top, you can add a 4-link suspension kit. Okay, for the motor mount, we need to slide the tubes over the M3x20s and pop them through the pinion cover. Insert the assembly through the holes in the gearbox and offer up the motor and do up the screws. There's no gear mesh to worry about here, everything is a fixed position. And in terms of a brush motor 20 turns or higher, you're good to go. Anything around 15 turns is a bit of a grey area, but usually okay. But when you get into the low teens, down to single-digit turns, you really need a smaller pinion and adjustable mount. These days though, you'd really want to go with a brushless power system, unless you really want brushed. And most brushless systems could most likely just brute force with the stock gearing quite happily with all their extra torque. And there we go then, one gearbox complete to step 16. There's a lot more to do yet, but that's going to have to do for this week. Right now, we're not supposed to be going outside for recreation due to ongoing issues. Now, I could argue that filming RC trucks is work related, but I think that might just be pushing things a bit, or maybe even a lot. To let you into a little bit of a secret though, the stock build was filmed a few weeks ago, and a very quick test run has been filmed. But that's only going to get us so far. So I'm going to have to stretch this build out a little bit more than I really wanted to make sure we can keep up the weekly content. All being well, once we get the truck finished, we'll be out and about again, and with any luck, meet up with a couple of other clods and bullheads. As always then, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!